No ar.
Hello, everyone. So today is the last day of BrELT Elf Week. So we have for me tonight, for you today, we have Telma talking about Elf and language values. Thank you so much for joining us this Saturday. It's an honor to have you here.
It's my pleasure. Hello from Brazil.
So, hello.
Okay, so Priscilla, can you do the honors?
Yeah, I will introduce you to Telma Gimenez, Associate Professor at Universidade Estadual de Londrina. Is a teacher, educator, and researcher interested in English as a língua franca. She co-edited the book Inglês como língua franca, ensino, aprendizagem e formação de professores. And more recently, English as a língua franca and teacher education, a Brazilian perspective. She holds a PhD from Lancaster University. And I have been reading all of her work for my own work here in Southampton, and it's really an honor to have the pleasure to hear you here in our week of webinars. So thank you so much again, and it's over to you.
Thank you, Priscilla. Hello, everybody. Hello from Brazil, from Londrina. I'm very happy to be part of this week's program. It's really an honor and a pleasure to be here and share with you some of the thoughts that I have developed over the last few years on ELF. And I hope that you will enjoy the session and that you will engage with the conversation that I would like to start with you. My topic is about values in ELF. And I would like to play a little bit with the double meaning of values, both in terms of beliefs and in terms of how much the English language is worth. That is, what kind of capital do you have when you speak English? So these are some of the questions that I'd like to discuss with you, introduce some of the questionings that I have been done and the things that I'd like to explore with you, because I hope we will be able at the end to have a conversation or more interactive part of the session in which we will be able to engage in a dialogue. So I think I'll start now, if that is correct, with my slides. Are you ready? Okay, so I thought of discussing ELF and language values, and I chose the title Pride and Prejudice, partly because there is a soap opera right now in Brazil that plays with that idea of the literary work, and also because I'm drawing on two authors who have written about language and late capitalism, and I'd like to discuss the idea of pride and profit as well as prejudice in this talk. So my thinking around this is, first we would explore some of the misconceptions about ELF, and I know that during this week you have already listened to people who have been talking about definitions, talking about misconceptions. I just want to recap on that, and also discuss a little bit about what I call prejudice, which has to do with language ideologies. The next part is talking about ELF as a research context, because ELF can be many things, and one of the things it can be is as a research paradigm or a research context for people interested in learning more about how English is being used in different contexts around the world. And thirdly, I would like to explore the economy of English and ELF in relation to that economy, discussing especially the commodification of language. And in the end, I'll just pose some questions that we can discuss later on. So let's start then with a short video. We're ready for the video.
Okay, so let me share. It's now the time that I play a small role in
Thank you very much for that.
You're welcome. You're welcome. Can you see my screen?
No, I will go to, yes, now I am.
Let me check it out very quickly here on YouTube. Yes, it seems to be working fine. So let's play this video that some people already
seen.
Play again, Brazil. This match is good for the Bafana because they have play one match good discipline, one match organized, have opportunity for the goal. But the last minute on ball. Congratulations, Brazil. I know you were training for penalties, but that free kick at that time, you thought that it would go into extra time, didn't you? Yes, I trained a penalty yesterday because I think Bafana support Brazil. Maybe they go to the penalty, I have a good player shoot a good penalty. I trained very hard yesterday.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
So, thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you. So I decided to introduce this topic by playing this short video because Joel Santana has been a subject of many jokes because of his English. And I know that you have already seen some of the clips similar to this one, where he, as a football coach, talks about the play, the game, the players, etc. In this case, he was in South Africa, and of course, he's using English in a context where it would be a lingua franca, right? And a lot of the prejudice that was mentioned by observers of this video, or people who watched the video and made comments on that, reveal that we still hold on to a very strong ideology of standard language, no matter how much we talk about ELF or the fact that English is no longer the property of native speakers. So as much as we talk about this, we know that out there, lots of people would say that Joel Santana is not very clever because his English is not good. So there is a lot of symbolic value attached to English. And I think that it's something that we have to consider when we discuss ELF. And this is the main theme, I would say, of this conversation today, because we have to consider all the implications of language use and how much prejudice can be embedded into the conversations that we have as we use English in different contexts, in multilingual contexts, or contexts where English is not native language. So I would like to start with the misconceptions then, because a lot of people would say that what Joel Santana is doing is wrong, or that something that is called globish is wrong. And as you know, globish has been advocated by this French businessman who created a very successful product out of this idea that English is now a global language. And recently we had a member of the Académie Française talking about globish as being very harmful to the idea of communication in a global world. And one of the misconceptions about English as a global language, that is that it equates globish or simplified form of English, can be seen in this cartoon, where, as we can see, both utterances are successful or can be successful in this communicative event. So if I say, would you please be so kind as to point me in the direction of the premises where I will find some relief, could achieve the same communicative purpose of toilets, please. Whereas the second one would be considered a more simplified or something that we would call globish, because it's a form that does not require a full repertoire of the language resources. And so when we talk about ELF, I want to make clear that I don't mean globish. I don't mean the fact that in some communicative situations, you don't need to use so many linguistic resources as globish is understood in this case. So ELF is not globish, and I think that that distinction is very important, because a lot of the prejudice against ELF has to do with that idea. And as I mentioned, Barbara Cassin has just been nominated for the Académie Française, and she has published a very harsh attack on global English, or that she equates with globish. So she said in an interview last year that there is already one language for everyone, and I call it globish, global English. When you want to order a coffee, you can ask for it in this language, whether you are in Beijing or in Tamanrasset in Algeria. It's a language of communication, a vehicle, but you must not confuse it with English. English is much richer than globish. It's a language of culture and works, while globish has no works except for applications for money from Brussels, even in France. So as you can see here, she's saying that it is a language of communication, and she makes a distinction between language in a full sense and a language of communication, which would be something more simplified or not necessarily attached to the cultural values of that language. A language of culture and works that she would see as important elements of English as a full language. So we have to think about, what do we mean by English when we use expressions like global English, international English, or English as a lingua franca? I know there is a controversy whether ELF is a language, and as such, it can be described, codified, and transformed into a new model of communication, or whether it is English in any form that is adapted or recontextualized in many different places, and therefore subject to changes. So in a study that was conducted in Taiwan, the researcher asked teachers what they thought ELF was. And according to her results, which match most of the research done on teachers' beliefs, is that ELF is a variety of English. Okay, some people would say this is a misconception, although at the early stages of the ELF research, it was in fact considered a variety of English, including the fact that we mentioned ELF users, as we would say, for instance, English users, ELF users. So that would, in a way, convey the idea that we are talking about another variety of English that is now emerging from this international context where it's being used as a language for communication by non-native speakers. Another understanding that teachers expressed is that it's a kind of English that is communication driven for non-native speakers. Again, we can see here that the teachers and many people would say that English that is targeted to communication as a medium of communication among non-native speakers is ELF. Another conceptualization is that it's a kind of restricted English that's been used in international contexts. Therefore, something like Globish would match this definition. Another way of seeing it is a kind of localized and less standard English, and that's something that's non-standard that could be recognized as such would be kind of ELF. Another perspective is that it is a function of English use. So I'm not saying anything about English per se, but I'm saying ELF is about contexts of use. So I'm not referring to the language per se. I'm not necessarily calling attention to the language, but I am looking at contexts of use. And some teachers would say, for instance, that it's a kind of broken English or an English that is not yet there. That is, if you learned it, but you don't know it very well, so you speak ELF. So these are all ideas about ELF, and I'm sure that you may find many other ways of representing this field or this area of research or this form of communication or this context of use in many other possibilities. So I'm trying to say here that ELF is a very complex area and of research and a very complex phenomenon that we are trying to understand. And as we move on in our attempt to understand it, we also face some difficulties of finding a proper definition or a definition that wouldn't be involved in a lot of prejudice or in ideologies that are very well much established. So we're saying we're now using a form of communication that resembles English, that is, some people would recognize as English, but it's not the real English. And if you have questions about that, I suggest you write them down because we can discuss that later. Now, if we go to the authors who have been very, very influential in this field, we can see that they also have definitions for ELF, definitions that are also fluid and in a state of change, because, of course, as a new phenomenon or as a new area for research, we are still struggling to find a definition that would capture what we are trying to describe or understand. So Soundhofer in 2011, in her seminal book, Understanding English as a Lingua Franca, she says, any use of English among speakers of different first languages for whom English is the communicative medium of choice and only the only option. And often the only option. In this case, we have here a definition that has been quoted in many, many places and has been transformed by later works by other researchers. For instance, Jennifer Jenkins in 2015 characterizes English as a multilingua franca. And therefore, she says it refers to multilingual communicative settings in which English is known to everyone present and is therefore always potentially in the mix, regardless of whether or not and how much it's actually used. And in her case, she says it's not about a choice. It's not necessarily choice. And so again, we see here that we are moving on with the definitions and perhaps getting closer to the thinking, to the developments in the area of translanguage and translanguaging practices. So is ELF, or English as a multilingua franca, translanguaging? And that's the question that some authors are now trying to answer. Again, here we can see that in the first case, we have any use of English. So the focus here is on use. And in the second definition by Jenkins, we see that it's about communicative settings. So the setting is important, whereas in the first case, the use is important. And we see that all these different points of view or standpoints from where we look at English will imply different definitions and different understandings. And why are these understandings important? Because, of course, depending on how we define it, it's what we are going to see and what we are going to, as teachers, try to bring into the classroom. I know that I'm talking more at the conceptual level here, but I'm sure that you will recognize that these conceptual distinctions are important when it comes to recontextualizing these ideas into the classroom. Another definition of English as a lingua franca comes from Alicia Kogo at Goldsmith, and she says it's an intercultural medium of communication. Remember, the first definition was about use, the second about settings, and now a medium of communication used among people from different sociocultural and linguistic backgrounds, and usually among people from different first languages. Okay, so now we have a focus more on the languages of the people who are interacting in these different contexts. Although it's possible that many people who use ELF have learned it formally as a foreign language at school or in an educational institution, the emphasis is on using rather than on learning. And this is a fundamental difference between ELF and English as a foreign language, or EFL, whereby people learn English to assimilate to or emulate native speakers. In ELF, instead, speakers are considered language users in their own right and not failed native speakers or deficient learners of English. And that goes back to Joel Santana. So would you say Joel Santana is using English as a lingua franca, and is he considered a language user in his own right? Or is he considered a failed native speaker or a deficient learner or user of English? Food for thought. Next, another possibility of looking at English as a lingua franca as a research perspective, and that's the point that I am trying to focus more now on, is on the use of English is not a variety of English used by non-native speakers. Rather, it is a theoretical lens to examine how English is appropriated and negotiated online in interactions by speakers with different levels of proficiency. So this definition takes into account that speakers of English may have different levels of proficiency. They may be, some speakers will be able, for instance, to speak like the man in the first part of the cartoon, the first square there, with more elaborate code, with more elaborate structures. And the second one, with fewer resources, less resourceful. Both we would say, have proficiency in English, but they have different kinds of proficiency or different levels of proficiency. And that does not prevent them from being communicatively successful. So in order to understand this, we need to take a theoretical lens, which I think is provided by the research perspective offered by English as a lingua franca and all the contributions of the authors who have already written about it. In order to show you how this could be translated into a course or as a pedagogical approach, 2 years ago, I introduced a course on English as a lingua franca or English in a more globalized world. And the course assessment asked the students to write a paper, and they had, either individually or in pairs, present what they understood of ELF and discuss them in relation to their research interests, since it was a postgraduate program, or related to issues that they found relevant to their teaching contexts, because all of them were teachers of English who were taking the master's degree, studying to get the degree. So in analyzing the papers and the understandings that they had, you can see here that teachers who had been able to be exposed to the ideas and discuss them with others, they offered some interpretations of what ELF is in a very interesting way, I would say. So, for instance, paper number 1, ELF is quite open to possibilities, for its users come from different first languages and distinct cultures, and as a consequence, it may incorporate structures and norms of their mother tongues to this form of international communication. So we're saying here that ELF can accommodate what in traditional second language acquisition research we would call transfer. That is, we take things from our mother tongues into this second language or foreign language that we are using, in this case, in this international language or global language that we're using. So what happens then when we do that is that this English is not necessarily the standard English that we would expect from a more traditional perspective. The second understanding is that ELF is about how English is alive, flexible, and built up collaboratively according to their participants and contexts. That is, English here is seen as an emerging form of communication that is very flexible. And again, this idea of being negotiated online and the need for clarification and a lot of pragmatic strategies to make sure that communication takes place. The third one is a lingua franca is a language. Again, here the definition includes the fact that it is a language used among people from distinct first language backgrounds. Therefore, it's important to note that English as a lingua franca, as the result of massive expansion in English use across countries, implies that English should facilitate human interaction around the globe. Again, here you see this understanding that lingua franca is a language, is not very different from some of the understandings that I showed earlier. of teachers in Taiwan. So here the context is not so important. It's just that noting that English has become so powerful that is now used for interaction among people around the world. And I would say this definition here is more conservative than the other ones. The teaching of English from an ELF perspective makes the individuals be seen as speakers and not only learners, and their interactions and innovations are not considered mistakes. English learners don't need to worry about learning a specific variety of this language, but having the necessary abilities to use it in a real communicative situation. Again, we're seeing here that communication is very much at the heart of what people think ELF is, and that communication is more important than the form of the language. Again, these understandings are important because depending on how teachers understand these things, they are going to think of pedagogical activities or tasks to be introduced into their classrooms. And what do all these ideas or understandings mean? Mean that we all have language ideologies, and one of them that is very pervasive is native speakerism. The idea that native speaker teachers represent a Western culture from which spring the ideals both of the English language and of English language teaching methodology, and that's the definition by Holiday. And native speakerism is very, very strong among English language teachers and among other professionals who are in the field. We know that this is, despite all the discussions and the publications and the production in the era of ELF, native speakerism is very much alive and kicking. Another ideology that is deeply embedded in this is the standard language ideology that we can see being expressed by all these comments on Joel Santana's English. It's a bias towards an abstract, idealized, homogeneous language which is imposed and maintained by dominant institutions and which has as its model the written language, but which is drawn primarily from the spoken language of the upper middle class. That is, we have this idea that there is a standard language that we all have to learn, and as long as we learn this standard language, we'll be able to communicate with anybody, anywhere. And this is not necessarily true, but it is the basis of most ELT industry. Now, I think I have sort of rounded up the ideas around understandings, beliefs, and the prejudice around ELF or English. And now I'm going to move on to the next part, which has to do with research. And as you have noticed, I'm focusing more on a research perspective because I believe the research that we produce has to feed into teaching, and the teaching has to feed into research. So this relationship is very important, and it's very important that we interact with these ideas in order to form our own thinking and be able to produce our own materials to use in the classroom. Some of the books that have been produced have been published around English as a lingua franca, which is now a very vibrant area of research and publications. Some of the oldies, I would say, are here on this page, and then we have some new publications coming up. These two new books, one is going to be published next year. The other one is, I think, on the pipeline. One is trying to bring ELF into the higher education system, especially thinking of English as a medium of instruction, which is a trend now very much promoted with very strongly promoted by higher education institutions as a way of internationalizing their institutions. Trajectories of change in English language teaching and an ELF-aware approach is more about teacher education and how we can promote awareness about ELF among language teachers. Both are very new and should be available for purchase very soon. Another series that has been produced, and I think very prolific in terms of English as a lingua franca, which is the series published by the Gruyter. And as you can see here, there have been many volumes dedicated to ELF, including, I'm happy to say, I'm very proud to be part of the organizer of one of them, with a focus on teacher education. But you can see that there are others coming up next year and 2020. So this is a good source for us to think about, not to mention the numerous papers that have been published, including the ones in the Journal of English as a Lingua Franca. We need to make sure, though, that these publications are more widely accessible, and I think the cost of buying these publications is also something we have to think about. We should encourage more open access to ideas that are circulating among the researchers on ELF. Okay, the third part is about pride. I have talked about prejudice in the first part, that ELF research has been producing a lot to challenge those prejudices. And now we're going to try to bring the idea of pride. That is, how do we frame the conversation about ELF around the political economy of languages? I'm drawing on a book written by Heller and Duchenne called Language in Late Capitalism, Pride and Profit. In this book, they argue that the dominant discourse and ideology of language as a whole bounded system, which is, of course, very much attached to the traditional ELT industry, inextricably tied to identity and territory. That is, English belongs to Americans or to the British, for instance, is central to the legitimization of the nation state as a particular historical mode of regulation of capital. So the idea I am introducing here is that the fact that we have an ideology of a standard language, or the language belongs or is a bounded system that defines a nation state, that is, there is an American English, there is a British English, helps to legitimize these nation states. There is Britain and the United States, and therefore places them as legitimate controllers or regulators of these symbolic capital. So the second point they make here that is important is that securing control over defining what counts as legitimate language thus became an important means for securing access to and maintaining positions of power within modern nation states. So who has the power to say that this language is legitimate or illegitimate? Who can say that Joel Santana did not convey the ideas he wanted to convey, or was not a legitimate language user of English? Okay. The third point is that inscription in the common cause of the nation state is a key element of that process through the mobilization of feelings of pride, of membership. I know that we don't have much time to dwell into this, but I would highly recommend, if you're interested in this line of research, that the pride, that is the idea that belonging to the nation state, or belonging, or my identity as an American or as a British citizen, is related to the use of English and a proper use of English, and that pride is very important as an element of membership or citizenship to these countries. So language is part of the idea of the nation state. The problem is that when we start to think of English as a language that has no owners, or a language that belongs to everybody, what happens to this pride? So the authors say that under capitalism, pride is reconfigured as profit. That is, we have to think that, in a way, it's very important to keep the idea that English belongs or is the property of native speaker, because that's what is going to grant them profit. So language moves away from modern ideologies of language, culture, and identity to be treated as a technical skill. And that's the tension that we can see here, because if I treat language as a technical skill, I have to decouple it from the notion of a nation state. And that's where ELF comes in. So is ELF, when we think of it as a medium of communication only, a technical skill that is decoupled from culture, and as Barbara Cassin says, culture works, and becomes something that can be amenable to commodification? Pride allows for legitimation not only of the production of profit, but also of its unequal distribution. So again, we see here another tension, that is, okay, if I say that English is a commodity, or English is a product that requires authenticity, and the authentic language is in America, in the US, or in Britain, that legitimizes the production of profit, but it also legitimizes its unequal distribution. That is, not everybody will be able to speak this American or this British English. Okay? So pride and profit are very much tied together, but they produce a lot of tensions as well. Because at the same time, this language needs to be used as a technical skill, and therefore more widely available. And so they say that language is involved in two major ways in the globalized new economy: as a source of symbolic added value, and as a mode of management of global networks. And we can see that as we talk about English being used by different multinational companies in business interactions, in the academic world, as we become more mobile, or as universities become more internationalized. So language, and in this case English, is very much part of this global new economy, in which language is also a product. So the tensions that they recognize and they acknowledge in the book is that there is a need to mobilize identities, part of the pride, commodification of national identities in the form of the marketing of authenticity. That is, what counts as authentic English? What forms of English, what kind of English do we consider authentic? Can we say that Finnish speakers of English are authentic, or we want the real English produced by native speakers in the United States, versus the need to technicize and standardize linguistic regulation techniques, that is, language as a technical skill decoupled from authenticity. And that's where I see English as a standard language as pride, and ELF perhaps as profit. How is it that English is profit? And can ELF be profit? At the moment, I don't see ELF as profit. It may be competing for that, but it's not there yet. So, for instance, if we think of the market, there are people now or companies that will revise your papers. If you want to publish, you need to publish in a good English, right? Authentic English. That is produced by whom? The native speakers or people who have acquired this language with a level of proficiency that will grant them the role of controllers of this language, and they will tell you whether your English is good enough. So this company makes money by revising papers. I'm saying this because my university right now has opened a call for researchers who want to apply for funding to pay a company like this to revise their work. Second aspect of the market are English native teachers, right? There is a whole world out there of teachers of English who are native speakers, who put a price tag on their work, on their nativeness. And you can see that this is just one example. You can see many more on the internet. Another one, translations, right? Who can translate and who are the good translator? So this is also part of the industry. Tests, okay? Tests are already part of this very big industry, and we are more and more required to present test results. And you can see that there are prices, all these things that I'm mentioning, there are values, not beliefs, values, money, dollars, pounds that are associated with English. So I'm coming to the last part now. I want to pose some questions. I don't know how much information I was, or clear information I was able to convey during these 50 minutes, but the idea is let us engage in a conversation now about the things that I mentioned. So one of the questions I have here is the political economy of standard language. Can the market be regulated? That is, journals, when they say revise your text, bring us a certification from a company that is accredited to revise your paper so that we know your English is good. Testing, show me that you know this language, bring your test scores. And quality assurance, what are the institutions that are responsible for guaranteeing that this language course is good? You have a stamp of this, you have a stamp of that. So who are the people there? Because there is a market for English. Who are the institutions, the people, the organizations that are in charge of the regulations? Can this market be regulated? The second question is, can ELF challenge the profit of the varieties of prestige? Are we moving on to teach English as a skill that is totally decoupled from cultural works and values? These are my reflections. Thank you very much for participating, and let's talk now.
Thank you very much, Telma, for the wonderful session. A lot of food for thought.
Muito obrigada pela
And,
talk, Telma. It was amazing. I'm sorry. I realized I was speaking Portuguese. Thank you so much.
Let's see if we have some questions. There is a little delay, so bear with us.
Okay.
Yeah, we have a question from Bruno.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Bruno.
So Bruno is asking, English is the most widely spoken language in the European Union. Could Brexit change the higher status of English as one of the official lingua franca of the European Commission in the European Union? What do you think about it?
Mm-hmm. Well, that would be an exercise in fortune telling. Okay. I don't know. There are some doubts whether English will continue to be the lingua franca of the European Union, what they call the Euro English. I believe for some time it will be, because there are so many, as I said, so many organizations, institutions that are there to guarantee that English is the language, the common language in the European Union. But that will also depend on the balance of forces among the countries in the European Union, and which country is going to be more powerful to impose a common language. I don't think that's going to happen in the near future, and not even if Brexit really goes ahead. I think that's going to be a long time before English is replaced by any other language, because, as I said, this is a market, and the markets cannot necessarily be entirely regulated. I think there are, at the moment, we are seeing some tensions in that, because, of course, as I mentioned, there is this tension of English as authentic English has a value. Authentic English has a value that is guaranteed by things like the things I mentioned, like you have to revise your paper, you have to present scores in your test, etc. So there are many mechanisms to guarantee that authentic English is worth more than any other form of English. And I think the European Union has already developed language policies to make sure that new generations learn English. So I don't think that's going to change that. I don't know if that answers the question, but that's my idea, my opinion.
Yeah, that's very closely related to what Jennifer Jenkins addressed in her talk as well. So it's very, very close to what she said. What I think interesting about ELF in Brazil is how it's related to teacher education. And I've read a lot of what you've written about it. So how do you think the teachers in Brazil are going to engage with ELF now that it's so clearly in a policy? What do you think about that?
I'm not sure that the BNCC is in fact talking about ELF in the same way we're talking about ELF. That's one thing. That's why I said there are so many understandings of ELF. I think BNCC was trying just to mention that the fact that English is now a language for international communication, and we have to consider all the different contexts where it's being used. I don't know if they really mean that we are thinking of beyond predefined language boundaries. I think that they are not into that. They still think, okay, there is a form of English that people will have to learn, and I bet it's going to be standard English. It's not any other way of communicating. It's English, and it's standard English, and we have to make sure that people are able to pass the tests and that they can perform well in different situations. And that's because I think profit in this case is so much depend on pride. That is, you have teachers who firmly believe that what they have to do is to make their students use English as close as possible to a native speaker's English. So that's something, that's pride. There is somehow a sense of identity attached to that. I am a very, very good speaker of this language because I can I can sort of pass as a native speaker or close to that. So that's still very strong, very, very strong. It doesn't mean that teachers are very close to being native speakers. It's that they somehow are guardians of this authenticity.
Yeah, and I think we have some other questions. Let me see. No, someone asking if the slides are going to be available. But
I think so.
I don't think so. Yeah,
No?
I don't think the slides, but the video will be available, so you can access at any time. They can access at any times. I don't think there are any other questions. Tiago, do you want to say anything before we finish?
Just want to say thank you, Telma, and thank you, Priscilla, for organizing this amazing event. As we said during the event over and over, this is about bridging the gap between academia and the teacher who is not a part of academia. So I think we managed to do that, and I'm very proud of this opportunity. And you should be very proud of everything that you were able to put together. And thank you, Telma, once again, and the speakers. Thank you so much, and stay tuned. Remember that in September, on September 7th, to be more precise, we're going to have our face-to-face event in São Paulo at Cultura Higienópolis, and there's going to be some ELF there going on as well.
Yeah,
so we hope to see you there.
With this event, we try to bring ELF to the LT community, so I hope.
Yeah, I don't know about you, Telma, but for me, Priscilla is breaking down a little bit.
Throughout Brazil. So thank you so much, Telma. It was really a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you. Thank you and Tiago, for this opportunity. I'm very much looking forward to continuing this conversation. I hope we'll have another opportunity to go deeper into this. I know I have thrown out some ideas, and we need some time to explore this further, and I would very happy to pursue this conversation later. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
All the best.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.